Hello and welcome to the program. Whistleblowers may become an important instrument to overcome corruption given their proper motivation and protection by the state. According to the deputy head of the President's Office, Ruslan Ryaboshapka, whistleblowers in Ukraine could be paid up to 10% of the value of the corruption they expose if laws currently being drafted are put into place. To talk more about the first anti-corruption initiative of the new parliament, welcome to our studio today Maksym Kostetskyi, is a legal advisor at Transparency International Ukraine. Hello and thank you for joining us. So, first question, taking this quote and this initiative, what's your take on this initiative that whistleblowers in Ukraine could be paid up to 10% of the value of the corruption they expose? How realistic it is to launch such mechanism?
Well, first of all, it's important to mention that the National Agency on Prevention of Corruption that was created in 2016 is the agency that is supposed to be protecting whistleblowers. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, since 2016, we haven't had a separate law that would be protecting whistleblowers. The initiative that would protect the whistleblowers and give them amount of the money that would be saved for the state is, of course, a positive thing. But it is important to mention and to understand that it would have effect on the anti-corruption prevention. So first of all, we have to understand that all the instruments that needed to be instated in this initiative have to be inside this draft law that would be adopted by the parliament. And second of all, it's important to remember that it's not only whistleblowers that have to be protected, but basically all the members, all the people that take part in the criminal investigation, except, for example, like witnesses of any crimes that are being taken, or witnesses of any crimes that might happen in court, in anti-corruption and other spheres as well.
So the idea would be to extend this protection, as you said, from like basically a witness protection in that case.
Actually, we do have a witness protection program in Ukraine, but unfortunately it does not work 100%. But there are some people that are being taken with the authorities in order to make sure that they are protected. But of course, if we're talking about anti-corruption, it's one of the top topics, topic in the recent years. And of course, whistleblowers may have a huge effect on the anti-corruption sphere itself, because if people do understand that people are interested in whistleblowing, of course, and they understand that there has to be zero tolerance against corruption.
How, because we talked about whistleblowers, we talked about witness protection a little bit. How should they effectively be protected? What would be the concrete means in place to protect them?
Well, first of all, we have a law of Ukraine on corruption prevention, and there is some mention of whistleblowers in that law. If we have a separate law that would be exactly on whistleblower protections, that would mean that the people that are taking measures in order to prevent corruptions, for example, sending letters to NACP or going straight forward to law enforcement agencies, that would have instruments from, for example, at least not being fired from their jobs. That's like #1 priority, because a lot of people are afraid that they're going to lose the sources of their financial incomes. And second of all, of course, it's a physical and psychological pressure from the people they are whistleblowing on, because there can be any thoughts of violence against them, or any actual perspectives that they might be damaged, or even the members of their family may be damaged. So first of all, it is important to make sure that they are safe. And second, of course, taking into account that prevention of corruption has to be built on the basis of zero tolerance against corruption. It means that the state of mind of a lot of people has to change, that whistleblowing is not something bad. It's actually one thing that may help our society to become better and may actually lead to the rule of law in this country.
Now, some of these initiatives operate in the US, but the US is actually a good example about whistleblowing, because when it comes to certain, let's say, big multinationals, or I'm thinking, I don't know, Rin Brokovich or that kind of people, they are being glorified. When it comes to certain whistleblowing, I'm thinking Chelsea Manning, I'm thinking Edward Snowden, then they're being prosecuted and by the states itself. how to find a proper status for the whistleblowers so they can be protected both by the multinational and also by the states when they are leaking some sensitive information.
Of course, the line is quite blurry here because you have to differentiate the main goal of the process. Like, what do we want to achieve here? Whether we want to become a much more democratic state, do we want to have a society in which people are can actually satisfy their financial needs in a legal way and make sure that their rights are not violated due to corruption. If we want to do that, that means that we have to actually praise whistleblowers because they're doing a good thing to our society. And of course, if society only reflects on corruption, and if corruption is part of our society, then of course it's bad for a lot of people that want to make money out of corruption. But I think that we are moving in the right direction. Like, for example, in a corruption perception index for the recent 5 years, Ukraine has going up like 22 places and 8 points. And this means that we are moving, but unfortunately moving slowly. So we have a big hope that in the next 5 years, this will become much more fast-forward thinking, and the legal initiatives that are presented by the presidential administration are going to move us to that to that place where we're actually going to have the rule of law in this country.
So does that mean that this ranking, does that mean that the perception of corruption is changing, or does that mean that the moral, let's say, perception of corruption is changing, or the awareness of corruption is changing?
Well, Corruption Perception Index is an international ranking that is presented by Transparency International, and it is based on various, almost like 13 different ratings where they take into account different businessmen, experts, international organizations, and taken it all together, we have this one criteria, where is the perception of corruption. Of course, you cannot specifically measure corruption because no one knows how much corruption there is in any other countries, which is why it's called perception. But taking into account that we have 13 different rankings, we can say more or less that this is the situation that we have in a particular country. Ukraine had 25 points out of 100. 5 years ago, and now it has 32, which means that we have been moving upwards, but unfortunately it wasn't as fast as we wanted from the very beginning. But still, we are only like 120th place out of 200 countries in the world, which means that there is a long way to go, and almost like all of our neighbors except for Russian Federation are higher than we are, which means that we still need to work, and we need to work as fast as we can, especially now when we have one faction especially forming basically the coalition and having all the possibilities to make sure that the anti-corruption reform would not become a failure, and actually do implement all the necessary measures in order to make sure that prevention and taking to responsibility or criminal liability for corruptionists themselves will take place in the next 5 years.
Now, that my understanding is, with those reforms that Mr. Zelensky's party is implementing, touches big corruption. Let's say, we have big players in corruption, bring them to court, and that could be a healthy process. What about petty corruption? Are there any initiative to prevent or to educate people towards what I would call petty corruption, which is, let's say, pay a few hundred there and there to have your way better?
Well, first of all, it's important to distinguish petty corruption from grand corruption. Why we talk about grand corruption all the time? Because this is the major thing for our country, because this is the thing that loses us like 5% of GDP per year. This is why we are creating National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and High Anti-Corruption Court, because this is the thing that fights the most against our economy and stops us from getting more investments in our country. But of course, petty corruption is as important as well, because this is the thing that actually builds this total understanding and tolerance against or for corruption in our country, which is why in recent years these processes have become parallel. The educational initiatives, the communication campaigns that have been in our country, for example, Transparency International once again did a number of communication campaigns against corruption, like where we inform the citizens in order to make sure that they know how they pay taxes out of their salaries, in order to make sure that when they go to the hospitals, they have to be provided services according, even after the medical reform has started, that there is a number of services that is free and they do not need to pay for them. When they are told that when they go to educational institutions, they can get this, and this, because they already paid for it with their taxes, and they don't need to do that double once again. And unfortunately, even like these basic things, a lot of people do not understand, and this is why it is important to talk about it all the time. And fortunately, it is once again moving in the right direction, because a lot of people are interested in this topic. They try to understand how to work, how to consider themselves, how to behave better, because unfortunately they've never been told to do that, and they've never been taught either, or in high schools or in universities, to make themselves the true citizens and the law-abiding citizens of this country.
Well, thank you very much for this interview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio to talk about petty corruption, grand corruption, and the work of Transparency International. That was Maksym Kostetskyi, legal advisor at Transparency International Ukraine. Thank you for watching the program, and stay tuned for the rest.